opportunity to speak to all of you. And I understand that you're starting a bit of a summer break, a bit of a break from your studies, and you still made yourselves available for this. So for that, I really appreciate at the end of the day on a Friday just before you're about to start holidays. So hopefully I will make sure this is worthwhile for all of you. Yeah, I'm very much excited by this opportunity when Ruth reached out to me through the Global Women's Tech Network event that had been online, to be able to take some time and hopefully provide you with some valuable information or some insights on a topic that is very relevant for the vast majority of us, especially women in tech. I'm Joanne Thurlow. I work at Siemens, and I am Canadian, not an American. This is an important distinction. It is something, Canadians are a bit of a funny lot because it's really hard to define what is a Canadian because we have such a diverse nationality about us, but we're always very, very quick to define ourselves as what we're not, and that is not American. And one of the other things I've come to realize that I am not any longer is an imposter or a fraud. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. I started at Siemens in 2011. I had actually left Canada in 2004 and I moved over to the UK. I started at Siemens 9 years ago, which by Siemens terms is a short period of time because many Siemens people have been there a good 30 years plus. So I'm still relatively new to the Siemens environment. I had moved over to the UK. I had actually just recently divorced, and I figured if he could have a midlife crisis and do that typical thing of taking up with a younger woman, I could have a midlife crisis because I believe in equal opportunity. So when I left for the UK, I had no visa, no job, and I just packed up and went for it. And I said, well, if it doesn't work out, it's a one-way ticket back to Canada, right? So I just went for it, and obviously it has worked out because here I am all these years later and still here in Europe. But when I actually started working for Siemens, within a few years, I had decided to look at other opportunities, and one came up that would then take me into Norway. What was interesting that in competing for this role, at that point I had started off, I was managing an IT team. I was a mid-level manager in Lincoln in the UK, East Midlands. And I had a team there and I was taking care of all of the projects. But when I moved into this new position in Norway, I actually became the global IT lead for the entire process, what is now today Process Solutions business. I won't bore you with all the details because Siemens goes through change after change after change, and the name of our organization changes almost every year. But at that time when I moved into Oslo, I was starting to oversee or be the main IT contact globally within the business. Now the business itself, what we do are engineering solutions across a wide variety of verticals. We actually today, then it was 5,500 people in 50 plus countries. Today it's 3,500 people in 45 countries. And I actually manage the IT from end to end for all 45 countries. That is actually part of my remit. So you can imagine it gets a little bit busy. But when I first went to Norway, what was interesting was one of my colleagues at the time had said to me, well, you know why they hired you for that job? It's because no one else would agree to move to Norway. So you can imagine suddenly, yeah, no kidding, right? So all of a sudden you're in this situation where you're about to take this huge step forward in your career. And somebody who is at a management level says, it's just because it's only you're willing to go. And you immediately start with the self-doubt. And it was at that time that I came to realize that and second guessing myself. I didn't know it at the time, but what I was actually experiencing was actually imposter syndrome. And after I had gotten into Norway, we had, and so I'm like 3 years into the organization, I'm this global IT lead, and Siemens goes through another change. And within 4 months of moving to Norway, circumstances changed again. And Siemens made a decision to actually create a global IT organization. So I suddenly found myself through good luck, being in the right place at the right time, whatever you wanted to call it, um, at a C-level management within the Siemens Global IT organization. And to give a bit of context for that, the GSIT organization, the Global Services IT organization at that time, was comprised of up to 7,000 IT professionals. There were 106 people at a level 3 management or above. The number of women, that was 106 people, and the number of women was 13% of that. So I was definitely in the minority. Um, and today that's actually changed again because we're part of Siemens Energy, and that percentage is now even smaller, although the remit has stayed the same. So when you find yourself in a situation like this and suddenly you have all of these self-doubts, is it just because I happen to be in the right place at the right time? I really don't deserve to be at this level. Um, there are all those people who have been with Siemens far longer than me. I would never have expected that within 3.5 years, I'd actually be at a C-level management in a global company the size of Siemens, but yet that's where I found myself. And all of those doubts I have since come to know, although I did know it at the time, were very typical ways of thinking about imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome, it is an identifiable syndrome. It was identified in the 1970s by a couple of psychologists, and they found that predominantly this is a syndrome that impacts women, but it's not exclusively for women. Um, and I do understand that there was an imposter syndrome speech that was made available to all of you a little while ago, but done by a man. So this time you get a woman's perspective. So maybe a little bit more relatable for you. Um, so yeah, this psychological pattern is very common, in which we start to actually doubt ourselves. We question ourselves. I'm an imposter. I'm a fraud. And we're become afraid of going forward. But as it turns out, the vast majority of people suffer from this at some time and at different episodes during their careers, usually whenever they're going forward and taking a big step forward or changing things up. I'm sure some of you felt when you stepped into this training program, me? Could I actually be one of those developers? Could I be doing this? Especially as women in tech. So, we all experience it, particularly if you're of a particular gender or racial background, anything along those lines. So everybody, and I think it's important to take away that everybody feels like an imposter at some time. And that's okay. It's okay for us to have imposter moments, those moments when we actually feel that way. But what's not okay is when we allow that to take over our lives, and then we end up living an imposter life, that it limits us in so many ways. And that's what I want to go through and help you understand, what are the symptoms, what are the signs, what are the coping mechanisms, and how can you move past them as we go through this, and then we can talk and answer any questions afterwards. And it's really important to make a distinction as well between being an imposter and being a fraud, um, because a fraud is somebody who intentionally misleads you, right? They know that they're actually being fake and they're doing it intentionally. Whereas with the imposter syndrome, we tend to, um, it's more of a subconscious thing and what we consider a self-doubt thing. So some of the three key takeaways I want you to get today, hopefully, will be to understand that there are many different gaps that you're going to face, that we face as women in tech. And it's not just limited to gender. It's not limited to sexual orientation. It is actually limited. It can be those gaps on the way to the top could be anything from um, gender, salary, culture, religion, sexual orientation. It could be how ambitious you are, because as women, quite often, we're not as aggressively ambitious as men are. It could be that you have parental duties. It could be age. So there's a lot of different gaps that you're going to encounter, many of them at the same time. A lot of those will be things that are going to subconsciously be there. It's not going to be somebody really in your face, or, I don't think you can do this because you're a woman. Mind you, you may well encounter that as well. But this is the imposter gap for me. I believe is a foundational gap, because it is that confidence. And if you learn to navigate and manage and mitigate the imposter syndrome and close that gap, then you're well on your way to starting to close the other gaps as you go along in your career. And one of the other takeaways that would like to give you is the whole thing about reframing your thoughts and how important it is to do reframing. And we'll talk about that and what that means and what it represents a little bit further into the presentation. So what are the signs of imposter syndrome? Usually it's acute anxiety, but is anxiety brought on by success? And we all feel stressed, or we all have anxiety at times, or self-doubt or things, but it's actually when we have a successful episode, something goes really right, and then we get really tense and concerned about that, because we think, well, maybe I was just lucky. I wouldn't be able to do that a second time. Oh my God, what if they think I can maintain that standard all the time? I'm sure it was just a fluke, something along those lines. And that brings on acute anxiety. And what is really the concern with that anxiety that gets associated to it is that anxiety can become very acute for us, and it can lead to breakdowns. And that's not uncommon as women, as you're going up through, if you don't learn to manage it. That happens. Many women's careers will get derailed because they will suddenly get overwhelmed by all that anxiety. And people think, well, what happened? You were doing so well. And we actually become our own worst enemies in worrying about that. Another sign of it is chronic fear of failure or painful perfectionism. And some people will say perfectionism is like the lowest standard that you can have, because there's no room for growth. And I really believe that. Is that I don't want to pass something in. I have to make sure it's absolutely, absolutely perfect. It has to be that much better than the next person. Lack of confidence on steroids, so it's really extreme. And it's important also to make a distinction between lack of confidence or low confidence and low self-esteem, because there's actually two very different things. People who have low self-esteem don't tend to achieve or even initiate things. They're not inclined to. Whereas if you have a lack of confidence, you're still achieving things, you're doing things, you just maybe are not entirely confident about yourself while you're doing it. And that's usually where you can make the distinction between the confidence, the low confidence, and low self-esteem. Overcompensation through workaholism. I have been guilty of that in the past. I am guilty of that today. I'm not going to lie. Getting that work-life balance is very difficult. And for all of you, regardless of whether you're married or you decide to have children or you don't have children or whatever, you're in the earlier stages of your career. So there's going to be other demands on you. And then even then, if you're trying to maintain that career and family and so on and push up through, it becomes we're more inclined to work that much harder to make sure we're seen as being those super women who can do it all. Another sign is we tend to very much underestimate, understate, and undervalue our successes. Quite often, how do we undervalue our success? Well, it was the team. I couldn't have done it without the team. The team really did it. If it wasn't for the work that he did, we would never have gotten there. And this is something that as women we have to be especially careful of, because we are more inclusive of our team members. That is natural. That's one of the things that was one of the strengths that as women we bring into our management roles. But sometimes we can give too much of those successes and the credit over to other people. So it's really important that you keep your own success for yourself and you acknowledge that. Um, as I mentioned, it's other people, it's luck, they made a mistake, you fooled them again. Oh my God, I got away from it this time. Next time they're surely going to know that I'm actually totally incompetent. You have those type of thoughts. And then we tend to rank ourselves lower than those other people around us. Maybe, they have a university degree or master's degree and you think, well, they're much more smarter than I am. These are things, and I say these because these are all things that I personally have experienced at various times throughout my 30 plus years working in the tech industry, which is probably longer than some of you have been on earth. To be fair, I've probably been kicking around this industry a little bit longer than you have. So what are some of those contributors that make us susceptible to imposter syndrome? First thing, we're human. That's it. We're all still super women, but we're human. And the human conditioning, usually those of us who are more susceptible to imposter syndrome, starts off in our childhood. Um, Maybe you weren't praised enough. Maybe you were overpraised. Um, Perhaps you got labeled. Like in my family, I was always labeled, well, Joanne, you're the smart one. You're the special one. You're the one who's really going to go on to succeed. Um, so you always had these labels that you felt you had to live up to, but you didn't necessarily feel that you were that person. Um, so there's a lot of things that can put us into a situation, and quite often those influences from our childhood, especially like for example, if you were raised in a family environment that was maybe abusive or controlling, we tend to overcompensate. And then we lead towards perfectionism, but then we always feel like we're never going to be good enough. These are all the things, and it's really important to develop a self-awareness about where you're coming from and what might have influenced you as children, because so often it's subconscious and then it starts to play out in our adult life and factor in. Students, you go out of high school, you come into a new educational environment, such as what you're doing right now, and then you start to think like, um, maybe I shouldn't be here. I think there's at least one of the students I may have seen of the videos on YouTube or something, that they're maybe in their 30s, a woman in her 30s or something like that. Now she may feel totally out of place because the rest of you are going to be that much younger. So she may feel like she's an imposter simply because she's a student or she's maybe an older student. Um, uh, but in the academic world, you go into it, you come out of high school, you come out of college, and all of a sudden you're faced with all these terms and concepts and things that are completely new, and it's a very competitive environment. So quite often you might be more susceptible to imposter syndrome in that type of a scenario, or maybe you have experienced in that scenario. You work in an organization that feeds on self-doubt, like that manager who said to me about Norway. That is somebody who has a culture of feeding on self-doubt. You know, um, uh, you work alone. A lot of times when we are actually working alone, we don't have that type of feedback. We don't have anybody to bounce ideas off. So you start to you feel more self-isolated. And I think this has probably impacted a lot more people over these last months by because of our global situation, that suddenly you're on your own for a lot of things. And how do you feel about that? And how might that actually impact you? Working in a creative field, this especially for actors and writers, or singers, where you're only as good as your last film, and the critiques that you get. Many of the famous people, I mean, even people like Albert Einstein and Michelle Obama, and Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks and many others often talk about the fact that they feel like imposters. They don't believe that they're as great as all those awards and accolades tell them that they are. You will especially notice this, and especially for us ladies, you represent your entire social group or even subgroups within those social groups. So it may be because you're female. It may be because you're from, you have darker skin, or maybe you're Muslim or whatever, but you're a woman and maybe even a subgroup as a woman. As a Muslim woman, and I've spoken with a few fellow women who are Muslim and in that environment, that they definitely feel that segregation as a result of that, and then they feel like they have to compensate that much more. So, how do we tend to try to cope with that imposter syndrome? How does it manifest itself? We do a lot of hard work to make up for what we perceive are our inadequacies. You might find yourself holding back from contributing in environments. I see this a lot in the boardrooms, where especially when I go into a meeting room, I am most often the only woman in there. And I think sometimes it's expected that I'm going to hold back from contributing. Sometimes it's like, why are you talking? Um, or they immediately talk over you without even realizing it. And then if you're inclined, as I am, and many of us, towards feeling that imposter syndrome, that can make you second guess yourself very quickly. And it can be a very subtle thing that you have to just try to be aware of. Sometimes what we do is we try to use charm or perceptiveness to win over influencers, something that's often referred to as the halo effect. Well, if they really like me, they'll overlook those shortcomings that I have, that type of thinking. So we tend to blah, 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 blah. I'm sorry. We tend to try to use that as another coping mechanism. Procrastination, this is my all-time favorite. I am an expert in this area of procrastination. I am that whole thing, working well under pressure, that's me. And the whole thing about not finishing things. If I don't finish it, if I come up with reasons why I had to move on to something else, then I'm not put myself in a position where I'm going to expose my inadequacies. And this is how you get to thinking. And all of these lead to a lot of self-sabotage. We become our own worst enemies because it's safer for us not to put ourselves out there and to keep ourselves back that little bit. Another way that we tend to sort of manifest um, imposter syndrome is passing on promotions or key assignments, or key opportunities. Um, I have one that's just been, two actually, that have just been put out to me in terms of speaking at CIO levels for global CIO events. And the first thing I was going to say, no, 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 that's way above my pay grade. I'm really not in that position. But, you know, and this is where the timing of this actually is very fortuitous, because both of those opportunities were this week. And my first inclination was going to be to say no. But what am I doing? I'm sitting here talking to you about imposter syndrome. And that's the reminder for myself. And wait a minute, Joanne, you're in the same place. Put yourself out there. Now, it's been 5 years since I moved into this position, and a lot of challenges have been there. And even now, there's some new challenges because our business unit is now moving in as part of the overall Siemens Energy. And Siemens Energy, if you're familiar with Siemens as a company, it's a global company of around 138,000 people in 191 countries, and it's made up of a bunch of different business units. And our business is being part of Siemens Energy, and Siemens Energy is about to split off from the rest of the big Siemens corporate ship. What's interesting now is, although we're a smaller number of people, and that we're 88,000 people within this business unit, and we'll go public in October, is that percentage where I had been at 13% of the women were in the IT top 3 levels of management, is now down to 8%. And I'm now going into a bigger organization with a completely different focus than where we were before. So I found myself very much that new kid on the block again. and feeling at a disadvantage because all of my peers have been a part of this, what was then Siemens Gas and Power, 4 years. And they know so much more than I do, and they're so much more in tune with the business. And again, when you're inclined towards the imposter syndrome and you get into these new situations, it tends to come back. But what's different now, I know what to look for. I know the signs, just like those speaking opportunities this week. And my first inclination to say no is to say, stop, Joanne. You know what you're looking at. This is what it is, and you know how to deal with it. And that's really important because we do tend to get into a groove, and we're not always subconscious. We're not always consciously aware where we might be putting our own barriers in. So how do you overcome imposter syndrome? Own your successes. Don't give them away. Yes, give credit where credit is due. Yes, sometimes it takes team effort, for sure. Don't downplay your success. Um, Sometimes it's been said about North Americans that we are really good at self-marketing and self-promoting, particularly the Americans. Um, what I found with a lot of Europeans and others is that they're not as much into that. But I think it's really important that you learn how to actually market and praise your own successes. One of the things that I do, and I started doing years ago, is I create a happy file. And in that happy file, I record my successes. I also, and you can see on point 3, also create an inventory of my strengths and my weaknesses. So I know what things I'm really good at and what things I'm not so good at. But I also have a happy file. So sometimes it's just a simple thing that might you might think is this totally insignificant to anybody else. But you know, keep yourself a happy file. And it doesn't matter if it's in your work or your personal side of your life. When you're having those days that are a bit more challenging, you're feeling a bit more down or insecure, go to your happy file, read it, because you will forget. I have a happy file that goes back to when I started my career in my 20s. And every once in a while I go back and I look now and think, God, so now it just seems like it was such a simple thing, but then that was a really big thing to do because that's where I was on my path of development. So do that for yourself is one of the best things that you can do. Whether it's a physical one, you put a slip of paper in, you make a little note to yourself, whatever. Keep a happy file on what you're doing. Um, Understand that all of us, we tend to have a voice in our head. Sometimes I call them like, you've got like, we have the good voice and the bad voice. So I'm not talking about our consciousness necessarily, but it's kind of like you've got this really shitty friend who sits on your shoulder. You know, that shitty friend that goes, girl, what are you thinking? You're going to do what? And they try to talk you out of it, right? And they really make you second guess. And then you've got, that really good, empowering, upbeat friend who's always going, oh my God, Olga, I'm so excited for you. Look, you're going to just go out there and you're going to kick ass. And Anita, it's like you are going to totally rock this, and you've got that. Now, those voices in our head, quite often we're not consciously hearing them or we don't pay a lot of attention to them. But what I suggest you do is try to tune into those voices and actually make them into a character. That really great friend, make them your hero, or that villain, whatever. But what happens when you actually do that is you start to create these little personas, and then you get a degree of objectivity and separateness from the emotions that might drive you or the feelings, and then it helps you make it easier for you to actually manage where you're going when that shitty friend gets on. I mean, for me, it's always this voice in my head, like I'll say yes, like accepting the job to go to Oslo or doing these things, and then suddenly I sit back and I kind of think, girl, what were you thinking when you said yes to this one? And the number of times I've said that to myself over my career is just incredible, right? And it's like, it is this shitty friend over here that's going like, what are you thinking, And hey, sometimes does it not work out? Of course, sometimes it doesn't work out. You need to own your successes, but you also need to own your failures or your shortcomings as well, because they're just as important. I don't like using the term failure. I like using the term outcome, because I believe everything is just an outcome, just some are going to be more empowering outcomes than other outcomes. I mentioned the reframing. Now, more and more people are becoming aware of the term reframing, but in case you're not familiar with it, this is the number one thing I go to all the time. If you have a really nice picture and you put a really tatty frame around it, or you put a really nice frame and it's gilded and it's wood, it affects the way that picture looks. And the same thing with anything that how you're representing something to yourself. And that is where the power of words comes in. The words that you use, the cadence, the tone that you speak with. Jill, we are so hard on ourselves, and we tend to, that voice in our head, the way we would talk to ourselves sometimes about what we're doing, you would never say to your best friend. You would never say those words to somebody else, but you'll say it to yourself sometimes. The words have a huge impact on how we represent something and the feelings and the emotions that actually get assigned to them. And you really, you can control your state, your emotional state, by the words that you actually choose, and that becomes a very powerful thing. And sometimes I'll tell you, really, you'll do this and you'll feel, I don't believe it, I'm saying it, but I don't believe it. That's going to happen as well. Keep saying it, then you will come to believe it. Normalize the feelings. Everybody feels this way, or pretty much everybody, at some time, and that's okay. It's not just you. Embrace any stretch opportunities. A stretch opportunity, signing up for the programs that you're in, that's a stretch opportunity. Maybe someone's going to come to you and say, hey, could you please help with developing this? And you don't feel that you're ready for it. That will be a stretch opportunity. Embrace them, because that's how you're going to learn and grow. And stop apologizing. Now, this is the personal one, really, in many ways. As Canadians, we're renowned for our politeness globally. Right? We are known for being polite and gentle. We say a lot, and we say sorry all the time. And I have been notorious for always saying sorry. And I've always considered it a Canadianism. My past manager, who was like the most amazing manager you could ever possibly ask for, he started right at the beginning telling me, stop apologizing, Joanne, stop saying sorry. And I came to realize I was already giving away my successes. I was already giving away my credibility before I even started to do something, because I was already saying sorry for something I hadn't done, expecting I was going to fail or not make the grade, not be good enough. So it's really important. And that I always put down to just being Canadian. Because God knows, growing up, if you didn't say please, thank you, sorry, your mother was going to be there behind you giving you a swat on the head, reminding you of your manners, pretty quick order, right? So, and it was becoming aware of that. And it wasn't until I was being challenged that I became aware that this actually was giving away my own power and my successes before I even started doing something. Reframing, it is things like as simple as saying, I can instead of I can't. That is okay. It's not broken. Those simple things create totally different contexts for us. With the whole reframing and changing the words and how you look at things, it's absolutely critical. And you can sometimes turn your entire day around just by looking at it slightly differently. So again, some of the top takeaways for you is to remind you that there are many gaps on the way to the top, starting with the imposter syndrome. The reframing of your thoughts in all of those different ways will help you manage your way out of that. And that closing the imposter gap syndrome is the foundation to closing a lot of the other gaps. I suggest to you that it is okay to have imposter moments. That's okay. We're always going to have them. But don't limit yourself to living an imposter life. Because if you do, you will never realize the full potential that you actually have and that potential is probably far more than what you have come to yet realize, because you're just starting out on your careers. One of the strongest forces in the human personality is our need to stay consistent with how we actually see ourselves. And that is so powerful for you to focus on, and to constantly try to change how you're viewing yourself if it isn't the most empowered version of you. And we all we'll struggle with that. Some days it's going to be easier, some days it won't. But it is so important to choose. Like if you say, I used to smoke, I quit smoking, well, I'm a smoker, but I don't smoke anymore, then the chances are you're going to go back to smoking at some point, because you're actually still identifying as a smoker. And subconsciously, the brain takes us towards whatever we're focusing on, whether it's how we see ourselves or what our goals or outcomes are. Our brain uses something called the reticular activation system, RAS, where as we start to focus on what we want or what we want to become or what we want to achieve, the brain subconsciously starts to work towards making that actually happen. It's called RAS. So this is really, really important, that you always try to have the best view of yourself possible. And again, for those days when that, like, oh my God, I'm not feeling very good, and the emotions are going, and with that time in the month, and you're definitely not feeling your best, go get out your happy file that you've been maintaining, because that'll help you get back into the happy space a little bit. So I would suggest you and ask you, make sure you take time, take stock of your strengths and your skills, so that you understand where your real value is coming from and what you're bringing to the table, because we all have that. Embrace and own your successes, and acknowledge and own your failures as well, because it's just as important, but don't dwell on them. Look at what you're going to learn out of those outcomes that didn't get you closer to where you wanted to be, but were taking you away from where you wanted to be. It's so important to do that. Acknowledge your learning gaps. Remember, you're not an imposter. You're somebody who is starting on a process, and there's things that you're going to have stretch opportunities. You're learning. And that's what it's all about. When you go into a new position, you don't necessarily know 9 of the 10 things automatically before you start a new position. That's the whole point. It's a growth opportunity. And reframe. Don't see yourself as an imposter, but rather see yourself as possibility in progress, because that is what you are. You are all possibility, you are all potential, and you're all in the progress of getting to that point. Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments? Thank you. I got some claps up there.
Thank you very much, Joanne. I have to say
Thank
that
you.
was very, very good to listen to. If you want to, what I can do is that if I stop sharing your screen, and then you'll be able to see the other faces.
Yep.
Then
I can see everybody.
There we go.
There we go. Look at all those beautiful faces. Excellent. Oh my goodness, you guys really are from all over the place, aren't you? Fantastic.
And so I don't know if anyone's got any questions they want to ask, or anything you want to say.
Yeah, I have a question. Jana, go first, please.
No, you go. It's fine. Go.
Okay. So my question is, John, you mentioned that one of the moments when you felt this imposter syndrome was when you joined the company Siemens, and they were restructuring the departments, and suddenly you became a manager or
yes, yep, C-level manager.
Team,
yeah.
Yes, C-level manager in the team who knew much more in the field than you knew, but you had experience in many other fields. So I will be in this position probably quite soon. So I think it's quite often when you join the company where the team is already established and you have to manage the team. So you are like invader, or how to say. Many, if you have any advices on that, because as I said, I'm a QA lead. Gladly now I have also development experience, thanks to CodeDop. But I'm starting in 1 week and a half, and I don't know what I will face. And moreover, we are in the COVID time, so I don't know what happened to the team. Like, it's a lot of stress and stuff. So if you have any
the COVID's definitely going to add a level of additional stress, because, and I think for everybody, because they're trying to get used to how to work in that environment. The first thing I say is congratulations. This is exciting. You have this whole opportunity ahead of you, and you need to understand that there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be new, and you are going to feel at a disadvantage. And you're going to want to push to close that knowledge gap and that comfort gap as quickly as possible. Don't overset those expectations on yourself. You are new, and it's okay to say that you're new. But when you sit down and you go into that call or whatever, you're going to be like, oh, not only are you the new person, you're the new girl. You know, and that in his own way. I don't know how many women are going to be on the team, but you know, that often happens as well. So the first thing is to say, okay, I'm here. There's things I don't know, and it's going to take me some time to learn. And say that to the team. Say, I will learn as quickly as I can, but there are going to be areas that maybe I'll learn faster than others. Try to identify who can help you on specific topics and become a bit of a cheerleader, because what I found is if there were areas that I wasn't particularly strong in and I knew this person was, then I would work really hard to make sure that I befriended that person as a bit of a coach or a mentor to help me get to that comfort level. And then what happens is, as you do that, they then start to buy into helping you be successful and for you to integrate into the team in a faster way. But just be realistic about how long it's going to take you. I say to anybody who's joining my team, first up, I have a really crack team. I mean, all of the things that we manage for in my business, as I mentioned, like 3,500 people, 45 countries, I do with a team of 10 people right now. And they all wear different hats. And I always say to anybody, if you're going to come into this team, you have to give yourself at least 6 months. It's a huge learning curve. Maybe that learning curve is going to be 3 months, depending upon what you're working on. But try to find yourselves some of those key colleagues. And the ones who are going to be the most eager to help will be the ones who approach you in the first instance and offer. So take them up on it. Don't be afraid to. And ask the questions. You get to play that, hey, I'm the newbie card for a while. Play it. Use it to your advantage, and don't apologize for it. One of the things that I sometimes do especially when I first came here to Germany was, I'm a Canadian. Maybe it's one of those cultural things, you know, whatever. And I'm fairly new to Siemens, you know, and I used to play that card every so often just to buy myself some time. So, and also, and for all of you after this, if any of you, you know, are in a situation and you're not sure and you felt that this is useful and you'd like to reach out for maybe a little bit of coaching or support, you can always connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm more than happy to answer some questions if it helps, especially as you get started. Because this is the part that I get from doing this, is actually supporting all you amazing ladies who are getting started on your career. Because when I started, we didn't have this type of connection available. So, but yeah, going back to your question, Olga, please, just give yourself time, get yourself those colleagues, befriend them because they're going to help, and just ask the questions. And people generally want to help. They're happy to share the knowledge. So, and there'll be one or two that you'll connect with more than the others. And there'll be one or two you don't connect very well with. Don't worry about those ones. Not everyone is going to be your friend either. Okay. Okay. Does that help?
Yes, that's
Thank you.
In your presentation, hi, I'm Nurjana.
Nirjana?
Yeah,
Lovely
in
name.
your thank you. In your presentation, you mentioned about working on your own. Could you explain that a bit more?
Absolutely. Especially these days, isn't it? So some people, they find that they're very independent and they're working independently. You're not part of a team. You don't have an office to go to. This is happening more and more. And it's very easy to get into our own little bubble, and you don't have anybody that you can bounce things off of. This is a lot of value in when you're at the office and you're doing that water cooler chit chat or anything along those, and you have a colleague to actually feed back to you. Um, when you're working by yourself, it's much more difficult to do that. Now, if your work is the type of thing where you cannot readily do that with your counterparts, your colleagues that might be in other locations, then I would suggest that maybe joining some like-minded groups, either through LinkedIn or other things, where they're maybe not a part of your direct business, but they're also other people that are working at home. So a bit of a peer group, that could be very useful. Because then you're bouncing things off and you don't second guess yourself as much. And you get feedback that, yeah, your thinking is in the right area. So some sort of a peer group is really beneficial. Or a mastermind group where it's not so much peers of people who are doing the same thing or in a similar position, but people who could be personal coaches for you outside of your current job or your role. And that applies even if, like, you're in an environment like me, where you have a lot of peers and teams that you're working with. It's always good to have people that are outside of your immediate working group or circle to actually act as and give you feedback as well. I think it's really important that you get some type of interaction in that area. Nowadays, with everybody being online, there's a lot of community groups and things where you can join in and bounce it, and not necessarily really large groups. Like I find 6 to 10 people, because then
Yeah.
if you have too big of a crowd, you don't get the time to talk through the issues. So it's better to keep it a bit smaller. But Nayana, if you can get yourself into that type of like external peer groups, even if you have to work on your own, it really does make a difference. And not just your close girlfriends or your family. You want people who are in your profession,
Yeah.
but not necessarily that you're working with. And that's really beneficial as well and can help you deal with that.
Okay, great. I'm actually South African, so the yes please, no thank you. I'm sorry.
You related to that, didn't you?
Yeah. So I'm like, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, because I'm teaching my daughter the same.
I think it's really important to have it, but it is the things where we have to also learn how to say no, and we have to learn how to stop saying sorry all the time.
The
And I
no
think that,
thing is my problem, is the saying no. Yeah.
Part of it's cultural. Part of it is actually being female. We are conditioned societally to be more complacent and accommodating. I found it incredibly challenging when I came to Europe. Not so
Yeah.
much the UK, because there's a degree of politeness, for example. But when I started dealing with the Norwegians and the Swedes, well, that just totally blew
It's just
me away.
cold.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, cold. It's like, holy shit, like what am I doing wrong? Um, and the Germans and the Germans on top of it, they do this thing where it's Mrs. Thurlow or Mr. this or Mr. that. And that really gets to me because I'm always first name basis. But growing up with my mother and that whole thing, I mean, she was so strict about Mr. Birchall or Mrs. and acknowledging people. And if you slipped up and you used their adult name, you got a swat over the back of the head. And so when I first started coming to Germany and they were always doing the Mr. Mrs., I'm always like, found myself doing this, waiting for that swat.
No, it's the same, because from South Africa to Hong Kong, and then Hong Kong to Europe, and Europe's been the most difficult to understand the cultural difference, and
Directness.
yeah, it's yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I mean, I
another.
found myself so often, I think, oh my God, you're so rude, Joanne. Like, and then I go back to Canada and people look at me, I think, I am being rude, but it's because
Exactly.
I'm behaving as
Exactly.
if I'm in Europe,
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's becoming aware of that it's really challenging.
Yeah.
It's good to hear that you think it's a South African thing or a Canadian thing, because I would say, I mean, there's other British people in here. I thought it was very British to say yes, no, and sorry all the time.
It's like a cultural thing, I think, at the end, where you're from.
Yeah, and exactly what Joanne was saying, I think actually a female thing as well. I mean, I don't know if any of you can remember Amefa when you were doing your presentations and you were all saying, sorry, I haven't quite done 100% of the presentation. And she kept saying, stop saying sorry. You've done almost everything, which is more than enough. So I think, yeah, maybe it is also runs into the female thing as well.
It is, and it's not, sorry, and it's not intuitive for us. It is very counterintuitive to be that direct. And I'm learning more and more. And it's funny because I'm like that at the office where I'm so much more direct. And then I take that attitude with my husband, who quickly reminds.
No, I got that last weekend. He's like, this is not a business. Why are you speaking? So it's like, okay, now I have to change hats,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But it's important. I think the important thing to take away is to be aware those cultural differences will be there. And a lot of our behavior is ingrained into us subconsciously. And the more you can become aware of it, the more you can learn to control it. So it does become almost like role play it. And that you have to go, okay, no, in this environment. I mean, when I first started here in Germany and I first walked in to meet all my colleagues, one of them looked at me, we have a woman on our team? You just think, and he was really excited for it. He thought this was a wonderful thing, which was very much appreciated. But yeah, it's a totally different way of thinking in the culture. So yeah, it's been a learning curve, interesting journey for sure.
I have a question about, hi, my name's Erica, by the way.
Hi, Erica.
I'm half Jamaican and half Italian, so I grew up with the culture clash all along. So yeah, I totally relate as well. And I moved back to Jamaica, and that was that was very interesting. But my question is, what happens when it comes from the outside? Because I totally relate to everything. And I worked in academia. It's a very isolated thing, individual pursuit sort of thing, not much teamwork. It all really struck home to me. But a lot of the things then was, okay, I had all the baggage from my childhood and all the things you said, and gender and culture from inside me already. But then when different, you mentioned a little bit, but how do you deal with it? How do you not take it on board? How do you deflect it in a way that doesn't make you look like the mad crazy one? If somebody else
I have occasionally looked like the mad crazy woman.
Okay, I own it. I've constantly imposter syndrome. I don't think I'm competent, perfectionist, blah blah blah. I downplay all my successes and things like that. But then when other people then assume I'm incompetent, or if somebody in a work setting, for example, from one project in research, this guy wanted to do the next, and at the end of the project wanted to collaborate with me and do another project. And I took him to another supervisor that I had a previous experience with. And the way they looked at me when I mentioned him, when he wasn't in the room, and said, oh yes, he's keen to do this, to write a proposal together on this subject. And the way they looked at me was so damaging, because they just looked at me, I was in my mid-20s at the time, a lot slimmer and more attractive, that the only reason that it must have been some sexual attraction reason why he wanted to work with me. It could not have been because of my competence. Or working with me, he saw that I was competent and somebody that he wanted to work with. What do you and it didn't even register at the time, because it was not even a word was spoken. It was so subtle and kind of covert. It was just the way they looked at me, but I took it on. I guess I took it on because how do you not take it on? How do you push back against that in a polite way, which doesn't somehow detract from your professional standing?
Um, I think that there's, I'm going to say taking ownership of it, but it's not owning it. Like, so, and see if I can explain this a little bit better. The situation you're in, and I think you make the really interesting point, because again, it's about those biases. And those biases are so subconscious and so nuanced. And it's just a look. It's a pause. And it makes you second guess yourself and you think, did I interpret that properly? It made me feel this way, but is that really what they meant? Oh, well, it must just be me. And then you have now taken ownership of that. You own that. You start to identify with it. And again, it's a very insidious, very subtle thing that happens to us. And the first thing is actually creating that awareness. And when you're in your 20s, especially, and you get put into those situations, it's really hard to separate from it. And it does play, and it carries on longer than you think, because then there's another slide and another slide, and again you just subconsciously register this, and it erodes away. What I found that has worked for me is when I've been in those situations, and there have been many, which would take a far longer conversation than what we're going to have today. But to give maybe just one hint of, as a young woman, when you first encountered this, I was a single mom. I had my first job after having left a very abusive marriage. My daughter was under the age of 1. I had a job working on selling computers in a computer store, which was absolutely critical as a single parent, young woman in her 20s, and all of this type of thing. Anyways, long story short, I had almost an opportunity to land a big job, a big sales thing. But the owner of that chain of stores said, well, what are you going to do for me to get this deal? And it was just a blatant sexism. And when I went to my manager of the store, and he said, you do whatever is necessary, you just get the order. And it's like that type of thing. So again, that was very in your face, whereas what you had is something that was far more subtle. But especially when you're a woman in your 20s, because to be fair, we're lacking a lot of confidence in our 20s. And our 30s and our 50s, it's still there. It can be very damaging and very undermining. There you have options. You can confront and call them out. You can speak to that. What I have found in most cases is that they're not even aware of what they're doing or saying, or how blatantly negative or hurtful their behavior may be, especially when it's more subtle, like you're talking about. So then I discovered, well, I have a choice. I can get in their face about it, and I can try to get them to understand. And in some cases I have done that because it was relevant enough, or the outcome was enough. And I learned to measure the amount of push I would put onto them to what would that outcome be. In a situation like yours, what I tend to do today is like, yeah, you know what? I know you've just dismissed me because I'm a bit of skirt. Well, fuck you, Charlie. I am so going to show you, and I'll show you with the results I get. Whatever it takes, the results will speak for themselves. And unfortunately, as women might quite often, I mean, you're all going to encounter this. If you haven't already, you will encounter this type of behavior. And so I look at it from the results perspective. Other times I have seriously gotten in their face about it and called them out on it because it was so blatant. Other times what I've done is say, you know what? I really like working with you as a colleague, and so I'm going to do you a favor because I really don't think you mean anything by this, but you know, that type of response, if I was a less secure woman, this is how it would make me feel, because I'm sure not going to tell them that they made me feel that way, right? It's like, I'm not going to give you that satisfaction. If I was a less secure woman, this is how it would feel, and this would be deemed inappropriate. And you know, you probably just aren't aware of it, but this is how it could be interpreted. So you might be a bit more sensitive. Sometimes I would have where it would continue and you would get that type of harassing behavior. Or inappropriate behavior, and then I would have to become much more plain spoken about it. And then sometimes it would be, okay, look, third time, I'm going to HR I'm going to file a complaint because you still haven't gotten the message. You need some type of diversity or sensitivity training. I'll recommend you for it. And I get really sarcastic with them. So a lot of it just depends on the circumstance. But what I try to do when I say about taking ownership of it is I try to control how I'm going to respond in that instance, because what I do in that instance may not be what I do in another instance. And yeah, I hope I don't know if I explained that very succinctly, but hopefully you got the idea.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome.
Also for the younger people, because it doesn't happen as much nowadays.
Yeah. Do you know, I mean, I'm dealing with the situation right now, even as a senior manager, one of our managers right now. I mean, talk about it, throw back to the Stone Age, and like seriously, and it has actually gotten to the point where I've actually had to give him the warning. If this continues, it goes to HR and it goes to our CFO for official complaint. You stop the abuse now, and yeah. So there's still times, but now that I'm in a position, then it's said, I'm a senior manager, you're a senior manager, it stops here. This is not a part of the sameness mindset.
You're on the same power level though, as it were. You're on the same.
Yep. And then sometimes I just make a bit of a joke about it, and I will sort of say to them sometimes if it's getting out of hand, and whether it's a sexist thing or otherwise, I'll just go, okay guys, I am so gonna channel my inner bitch. Let's talk. And I kind of get this bit of attitude, which really puts them off. But I can carry that off. Now, that not everybody can speak that way, but I'll do that because they'll start to laugh because they know they're probably already thinking that, or it's like they can relate because sometimes their wife is like that or something along those lines. And I make it a little bit fun, and I break it and I put it out there and say, okay, now I'm going to, because you know that they're thinking, well, you know, with women, if we're assertive, if we're direct, you're being bossy, you're being bitchy, you're being all this. This is what we get. So yeah, okay, guys, you're about to think that I'm a bitch. Like this one senior manager who has been giving me such a hard time. My manager in the IT, she had offered to intervene for me. She said, he's such a bully, like he really. I said, yeah. I said, he's a schoolyard bully. That's the best way to think of him. I said, but he hasn't realized yet he's dealing with the schoolyard bitch. Let him deal with it.
Very much. But we've now got a range of options before you
exactly.
accept it or fight and and now you've given me a range of options. So that,
yeah, and measure the amount of effort and emotional investment based on what you're going to actually do. Okay, but always try to do it with humor and just. To be fair, it's just not worth it. A lot of cases, but you don't want to create a culture or a circumstance where it's enabling or allowing them accidentally or subconsciously either. So,
great, thank you.
Okay. So anybody else? Any questions?
I have a question, if it's okay.
Please.
I mean, now you're, like you said, you're C-level manager, so you're up there with kind of the top ones. Do you think imposter syndrome ever goes away? As in,
No.
can you reach a point where you say, I'm here now, I can confidently say that I deserve to be here? Or do you think it's everybody, well, and then I guess another question would be, do you think it should be talked about more in a work environment so that you can discuss with the other managers as to see whether they are also experiencing the same thing?
Answer the first question, does it ever go away? I'd have to say so far it has not. Is it less? Yes, because now I have the awareness and I know what to look for and I know how to shut it down and remind myself that yes, I am possibility and progress. I'm in a learning capacity. It's okay if I don't know this stuff, I can learn it. So that's the first thing, and I try to remind myself. And look, I'm not going to lie. I mean, saying that some days I feel I so got this, and then other days it's like, no, I don't have this at all. Or I have those really bad days and I really doubt myself and I go get a glass of wine and I crawl into my hot tub with a bottle of wine. It's like, that's it for I mean, whatever it takes. So you're going to have both the good days. I don't think it ever goes away, but do I manage it better because I have awareness and I have a coping mechanism for it? Yes. Do I hope that one day I will be that totally confident woman in everything that I do. Yeah, and I'm constantly striving to get to that point, but it's a long journey, and it's a continual journey. Um, do I think it would benefit from talking about it more? Absolutely. We definitely need to talk about it more in the workplace. We need to make it okay. Like I said, in one of the point is to normalize it. Almost everyone's going to feel this way. Uh, excuse me. And just an interesting little side story. When I first presented on this in 2018 at the European Women in Tech Conference, it was the first public speaking event I had done in 20 years. Ruth has seen the presentation, which is in part what led to me being here today. I was absolutely terrified in doing that presentation and so on. And afterwards, I had a large number of younger women come to me, especially the younger women, and talking. There's about 20 of them gathered around. And it was like, that was when I realized I actually have a lot of experience and value to share with all of you. And I'm really interested in doing that. But this one woman, she was very quiet. She was from France. And, she asked a few questions. And it wasn't until a year later, and I ran into her at the next event, which was last year. And she came up, and she, as it turned out, was, instead of being a spectator, was actually being one of the speakers. And she explained to me that after the conference, the conference in 2018, she had to go back to all of her, which were all male colleagues, and present on all the things that she had learned. And she said, the one thing I focused on was your presentation. And I took them because it just resonated so much with me. And the men who came to her afterwards, because they would not do it at the moment when she was presenting in the room with everybody, but they came to her afterwards and said, that's me. I can relate to that. That was really helpful for me. But what she also came to realize is that I don't have to put up with all of this. And she had since changed her job, went into a management position, had herself registered as a speaker at this event. She was this really quiet, shy young woman, and she was loving her job and totally kicking ass. And she's like, you changed my life because you made me realize it wasn't that I wasn't good enough. It's just that I was just learning, and it was okay, and that I'm not that person that they sometimes would make me feel like. And I thought, good on you to see in that period of time, just by having the awareness, by talking about it. And it really had an impact, and I'm like so happy for her. So I think it is important that we talk about it. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of things that we need to talk about, especially as women in this industry. Some of those examples of the situations that I have faced and been confronted with, and as a young woman or halfway through my career, or the disregard that I get, there's a lot of those real situations that you encounter. It's not just what it's like working in a work culture and the cultural issues and the dynamics of working in teams. It's those really more personal issues. I get fired from a job as assistant. Was a position. Oh, I was doing I think a sales thing, I can't remember, director position or something. I think it was at a director level. And you know why I got fired? Because I actually hit the assistant vice president of sales. Because he was so, no, I do not recommend this, okay? This will end your job right then and there, which it did do. But he was so in my face. He had actually scooped, I had a $250,000 deal I was about to sign off, and he had gone behind my back and scooped the deal. And when I confronted him about it, he actually became very physically threatening to me, and like really like in my face, doing this, and all the rest of this stuff. And I said, hand it in my face, or else I'm going to hit you back, this type of thing. I said 3 times, 3 warnings. He didn't do it, so I hit him. And then I walked in the VP's office, said, guess what just happened? I'll go pack up my desk now, shall I? It was like not my finest moment. I would say that's not how best to deal with the situation. But sometimes shit happens, right?
I feel like we need to have you here for a long time to hear.
I know. It's just like there's so many stories I can tell.
If it's okay, I've got one more question as well that's quite quick. You mentioned you had a happy file, and it's really interesting because we had another speaker, the one I was telling you about, that came and talked to us about imposter syndrome, and he said he also had a happy file. what do you keep in there? I mean, is it emails? Is it notes to yourself? What kind of things go?
Combination of all of the above. It could be accolades for a job well done from somebody, definitely. Sometimes if, say, I've been in a situation and I dealt with it better than I did with that assistant vice president, and I dealt with it in a proper way, even though it was and I didn't let my impulses get the best of me. My dragon didn't get loose. I might make an actual note to myself on that. And put it in there and say, look, you controlled your temper on this given day in this given circumstance. You didn't let the bitch out, type of thing. Anything along those lines. Sometimes it's personal things that happen on the personal side that particularly resonated with me, or on the job side. And it could, like I said, it could be just little things. It could be big successes. It's a combination of all of it. And I think it's really important to not always focus on the big successes. They come and they're there. They're fewer and farther between, but really take stock. And so often you hear people about saying be grateful every day for things. And I am somebody who does try to daily practice meditation, visualization, and gratitude. I do that on an almost daily basis. But it is the little things in your career, the little successes, those little wins that you get during a day, especially on the bad days. And if you've managed it well, that's a really good reminder for yourself. Could be anything that just makes you smile or whatever.
Thanks.
If we have 5 minutes more, I have another question.
I'm happy to. I'm finished my day job for the day, and I am here for you guys. So it's just like, yeah.
Okay. So I am a Soviet Union child. So we were raised in a very, very different way than Europe. And what I faced that in my work in Ukraine or in Latvia, which was also part of Soviet Union, it was we separate like a personal life and professional life. So even if you are not friends at work, it's still easy to work because nobody expects you to be their friends. And what I realized here is that it's like if you're not friends, then you will have problem working with this team. So I don't know if it's the same in other countries, because I faced this in Spain, and for me it's very different, because I don't care what you do, I like you or not. If you're good professionally, I work with you. If you make a good decision, I accept your decision, because not because I like you or you're my friends or we drank together yesterday or we went running yesterday, but because the decision is good. But what I saw is actually some absolutely ridiculous decisions were accepted. And when I say ridiculous, I think like in Soviet Union, they would cut hands for making these decisions, It's crazy. 10 years ago in IT industry, like you would be fired for taking this decision. And only because those people were friends. So like, okay, this is a good decision. So, and of course, when you don't follow this, then you feel like outsider. So it's a little bit like imposter syndrome, because you start doubting yourself and like, am I doing something wrong, or what's going on? So I don't know, have you seen something like that, or like what can you say about it?
I think a lot of that comes down to the cultural differences. And I think it's important to understand the cultural differences can make you feel like it's imposter syndrome, for sure. It's been interesting in my experience in working with people from Russia. I mean, I've worked with people from all over the world, right? So there is a world of difference between somebody from Russia or Finland or Iceland who is very cold. It's like one of my colleagues, we're always joking because he's Russian, we're no emotion, I'm Russian, and we're always like, with my very bad Russian accent here. And we're always sort of joking about that, because he's so pragmatic and it's not that I don't feel things, there's just no room for it in the office and things like this. And we often sort of acknowledge that that's his approach, because for some of us, initially, it was actually really hard to understand that. It's just so, what's with him? Like, there's nothing there. Then you get the complete opposite, and you said you're working with people from Brazil or Spain? Spain. The Spanish are very warm and gregarious and emotive, and the Brazilians are crazy in that way. Like they're so like just hug you, and they're so out there. And if you're somebody who's from a culture where it's not, that's a big culture clash. And I think the first thing is to understand it is a culture clash. And I think it's worthwhile to try to bridge it a little bit and try to find ways to bridge it and bring a little bit to sort of temper some of that that sort of that more um, I don't want to say frigid because it's not the word. Rigid, it's not the word either because it is totally the wrong word. But the very sort of stricter approach to the separation of work and so on, as opposed to the others. But and then the flip side of that, you're right. There is that whole scenario where just because they're friends, they don't want to offend and say that this is not a good idea. So part of it is actually learning the diplomacy of how can you challenge that in a way that they turn it around and they have to second guess themselves so that you can get that point across in a way that's not quite so direct that it might be seen as offensive. And that's not an easy skill to develop. It can be developed. One thing I would suggest is one of the things I've found that worked really for me in learning how to flip those scenarios around is neurolinguistic programming, or NLP, which really helps you understand how to communicate with the other people, because that's what it comes down to. And it's not necessarily communicating in a way that you understand, but it's actually learning how to structure your communication that it resonates with that individual, because then you can start to close that gap and get the point across. And that's a soft skill, but I have to say is one of the most critical skills that I use at times. If it isn't humor or sarcasm, then it's something along that. Then the really important things where you can then connect with them in a way that's not seen as cold or as distant, but then you're not also having to compromise and say, oh, I'm going to try to now be your best friend in the workplace, because that wouldn't be natural for you either. So it's finding that. So I think if you can look at some of the NLP skills that you can learn to develop for actually looking at it from their side and working on those communication, then that would help you tremendously in that regard. And to quite honestly, one of the biggest skills that you need, especially as senior management, is the ability to communicate and be sensitive to those cultural differences, and having to adapt. So when we have someone from India on the line, as opposed to some crazy Canadian like me, sometimes I have to really kind of think about how I'm putting things forward, and I am not a conventional person. You might have caught that already, which in a very structured conventional world like Germany and Siemens, it's a similar type issue. And people, I mean, I'm somebody who hugs, right? So this would not work for you, but
No,
for
no,
me,
no. Actually, it's paradox is that I have a lot of friends from my previous work, but it was not like forced friends,
yeah,
It was established with time, and some friends are like 10 years ago we worked together, and we visit each other in different countries, and from all the works that I have friends, and even from Spanish, but
yeah,
yeah, it's still
yeah. It is. It is that cultural thing. I mean, I started hugging everybody, and I mean, you should have seen some of these German senior managers. Like, what? It's like, oh, whatever. And those who knew me, they just got to the point where it's like, oh, it's just Joanne. It's it's just her way. So yeah,
Germans
but
are a little bit like that. They also separate private life and work.
yeah, absolutely, they do. They do.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So it's just the cultural sensitivities. Hi. Okay.
Perfect. So I guess if no one, I mean, I don't know if anyone's got any last questions. We've kept you here a long time, so I don't know if anyone's got any last questions, or that's it.
Okay. And then, yeah, if anybody, any questions afterwards or things like that, as I said, you can reach me on LinkedIn, or if like, say there's a lot of questions, or we just want to have like an open forum discussion or something. I mean, if Ruth wants to organize something, I'm happy to make time available for everybody, just to, that type of chat, Q&A, whatever.
Definitely. I feel like there's lots of stories that we want to hear from you. So you just
There
touched
are.
on
There
them.
are lots of stories.
What we could do is we can definitely, I was thinking just now, we can add you to our community Slack channel as well, where everybody is, so they know that you're there, so they can reach out to you if they want to.
Okay.
And a few people had to drop out because they had a couple of meetings. They said, please send me the recording because I want to see the end of this.
Brilliant.
And so the recording will be on the community Slack channel, and then I'll also send you one as well.
Brilliant.
Yeah, as well. And I think that's it. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a lovely
Yes.
weekend. And thank you, Joanne, so much for your time today. I know you're a busy woman, so
Well,
great.
thank all of you so very much. I've really enjoyed it and enjoy the chatting, and hopefully it's useful for you. So, for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.